He saw himself as a minister who was going to serve Christ and his sheep. But the second thing is the absolute essential nature of the Trinity for his approach to apologetics. Again,
Oh,
that's
it's so
something.
essential.
Yeah, that's something that doesn't always come out in all the material that's out there. Of course, the exception would be Dr. Tipton's dissertation that he wrote on Van Til, which is just magisterial.
Hmm.
Uh, but setting forth Van Til's doctrine of the Trinity, which is really the work that set me on this understanding of the role of the Trinity in Van Til's theology, which ended up affecting his approach to apologetics, and then that takes me to the third thing that isn't said nearly enough, which is that in order to understand Van Til and his method to apologetics, you have to understand what he was doing, which is trying to bring his theology, Reformed theology, in line with apologetics, so that we don't have, let's say, a Reformed theology and then an Arminian approach to apologetics,
Precisely.
which is the way that he tagged, for instance,
Hmm.
Butler and others. Uh,
Gerstner, and,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, the whole night, the evidentialist classical approach,
Hmm.
which even by Reform people like in old Princeton, you've got an not RB Kuiper, Abraham Kuyper, where you've got these solid Reform guys, but then when it goes to the question of how we engage the unbeliever, it kind of falls apart, and you fall into a method that's more keeping it with Arminianism than Reformed theology. So Van Til wanted to make sure that our theology, our Reformed theology, and our approach to apologetic did sweetly comply.
Yeah.
So those were the three things I tried to hammer home throughout the course of the week.
Oh, I appreciate that. I've always thought that the Trinity is so central to Van Til's writing, and you find it front and center in Introduction to Systematic Theology, which is a course syllabus that eventually got developed and published as a book. But there you find and see how foundational this is. And that's something you find like folks like John Frame will talk about Van Til's doctrine of the Trinity, but not develop it certainly to the extent or apply it as much as Van Til did, and certainly not as much as what you find in works like Lane Tipton's. But then you also find Frame, who's really weak on the transcendental argument and its uniqueness. You find Bahnsen, for example, is really strong on the unique nature of the transcendental argument and method, but almost doesn't speak at all about the Trinity or how that applies to Van Til's apologetic. And so you have to have both, and the Trinity needs to be addressed, and we have to understand what Van Til meant by how the persons relate, his doctrine of perichoresis, his understanding of equal ultimacy. All of these things are so critical, and I echo your thoughts that Lane's dissertation really set me off on my own research as well, and so that features and factors in a large measure in my dissertation on Rahner, and what should be out as the Rahner Great Thinkers book, hopefully at the end by the fall of this year. That's a big feature in there. Same thing with the chapter that I wrote in the Vern Poitras Festschrift. Van Til is just he's utterly important. He's really advancing things in a helpful, orthodox way when we understand what he's actually doing.
Just a quick funny story, and I'll wrap things up with this. But you mentioned the idea of equal ultimacy, and of course, Van Til talks about equal ultimacy in terms of the Trinity, the persons and the oneness, the threeness and the oneness of God, the one and the many, equally ultimate. And I didn't know it at the time, but apparently there's no English or Spanish translation of that expression. And it
I'm
was
sure
it
there are
was
a few. Concrete Universal, you could probably come up with one, but I'm sure there are a handful of Van Til isms that are not
that don't
available
translate
in
into Spanish.
Espanol.
I absolutely stumped the translators with that one, and I didn't mean to. I just it was that expression I used, and we're doing our rhythm. I would say something, the interpreter would translate, and then I said equal ultimacy, and then it was like dead silence. There was just there was no kind of there was no expression that they have readily at hand to articulate that, and so we had to figure out an end around
Yeah.
around that expression. But
If you want to
anyway, it was
see
kind
your
of a funny
computer
moment.
smoke, I recommend you pasting a chapter of Van Til into Google Translate and see what happens. or at least the Google Cloud will start to screech to a halt as millions of whatever teraflops start to try to understand what he was getting after.